His Majesty's trawler HMT Juniper was a tree-class minesweeping trawler of the Royal Navy that served during the early months of the Second World War at the close of the Norwegian campaign. The ship, purposely built for the Royal Navy in 1939 by Messrs Ferguson Brothers in Glasgow, was based on traditional fishing trawler designs that were commonly available at the time, but fitted to meet the needs of a wartime vessel. Crewed by 35 men under the command of Lieutenant Commander Geoffrey Seymour Grenfell, the Juniper was tasked with escorting the 5,600-ton tanker SS Oil Pioneer and 2 other ships from Tromsø in Norway as part of Operation Alphabet, the evacuation of the British and Allied forces from Norway. One day out of port, the Juniper sighted heavy warships, and her wireless operator, Charles Batchelor, urgently signalled on reporting her discovery. Ordering the Oil Pioneer to sail independently, she hoisted her battle flags and proceeded towards the biggest ships to challenge them. The reply from the largest ship ahead indicated that she was the British cruiser Southampton, but this was a deception. She was in fact the Admiral Hipper, a German heavy cruiser crewed by 1,600 men under the command of Vice Admiral Wilhelm Marschall, accompanied by the Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and 4 destroyers. Marschall was acting on the intelligence provided by the Luftwaffe of 2 groups of ships operating nearby. He decided on his own initiative to attack the southernmost group, escorted by the Juniper. The Hipper's heavy guns proceeded to decimate the smaller vessel. Only 4 crew from the Juniper were pulled from the water, along with 25 men from the Oil Pioneer. Also destroyed was the empty troop carrier Orama. However, in an act of mercy by the German Navy, the hospital ship Atlantis was spared. Later that same day, the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau encountered and sank the aircraft carrier Glorious and the destroyers Acasta and Ardent. Charles Batchelor, service number 499/X4624, was a telegrapher on the Juniper. The following is his account of that fateful encounter and the aftermath. Written at his own typewriter a number of years later, it is headed in capital letters by the phrase, "This is a true story." It is clear that in the years that followed some dates are slightly out, misremembered in the haze of what followed, but the key points immediately after the battle confirm what we know. The Juniper was destroyed, and no more than 4 of her crew were recovered by the Hipper and taken to Trondheim in Norway. We know that Marschall had sent the Admiral Hipper and the destroyers to Trondheim to refuel before its encounter with the Glorious. The following is Charles Batchelor's account. One day out from North Norway in the Arctic, on the 5th of June 1940, we were attacked by a German naval squadron consisting of 2 battleships and 3 destroyers. The time was 6 a.m. and the day was misty. The action only lasted about 10 minutes. We were hopelessly outnumbered, and the ship was practically blown to pieces. I was riddled with shrapnel, but fortunately did not lose consciousness. Just before the ship turned turtle, 2 of my messmates and I managed to climb the rail and slide into the sea. We swam in the general direction of the nearest German destroyer, and after about 20 minutes the Germans fished us out. 4 German sailors carried me into the sick bay, and the medical officer cut my clothes from me, smothered me with iodine, and bandaged me, and gave me an injection of morphine. Then I was wrapped in blankets, carried into the forecastle, and laid on a bunk. I had a raging thirst, but owing to the position of one of my wounds, I could not eat, or drink, or even speak. At last, by sign language, I made one of the sailors understand that I wanted water. So he brought me some cubes of ice, and by laying flat on my back and placing a piece of ice in my mouth, which gradually melted, I was able to satisfy my thirst. It was the best drink I'd ever had. After 30 hours on board, I was landed at Trondheim in central Norway and sent to hospital. The hospital was staffed with German army doctors and orderlies and Norwegian nurses. The nurses washed me and put me into a bed and did everything they possibly could to make me comfortable. After 2 days, I was examined by a German doctor, and he put my left leg and jaw in plaster, and my left arm was put in a cradle. The following day, a vulcanized rubber tube was put into my stomach via my left nostril. After that, a nurse fed me 3 times daily. She pumped liquid food into my stomach through the tube. The doctor said he could not do much for me, and I would have to wait until I could be sent to a base hospital. I had to wait there for a fortnight, always in great pain, always hungry. I wrote a letter to my wife while I was there, and one of the nurses smuggled it into Sweden, and my wife received it on September the 9th. It was the first news of me since I was posted missing. Nearly every day while I was at Trondheim, the RAF came over and bombed the harbour and the docks, close by, but the hospital was not damaged. When everything was ready, I was put into an ambulance and taken to the railway station. There I was put into a bed in a cattle truck. In this cattle truck were 6 beds, but 15 patients. All of them were Englishmen, Army, Navy, Fleet Air Arm, and all of them were wounded. So those who were less seriously wounded had to lay on the bare boards. We were given 3 loaves of black bread and 2 tins of sausage meat and a bucket of water, and then we were locked in. The food was scanty for the others, but there was none at all for me. We were travelling for 60 hours in that truck, which was of course not sprung, and we were in a mountainous country, so we were all badly shaken up. At last we reached Oslo, and we were taken by ambulance to the hospital. I was carried up to the ward, and washed and fed and put into a bed by a Norwegian nurse. 2 German doctors examined me and said that they would have to operate at once. They could only give me a local anaesthetic because I was so weak. I was on the operating table for 4 hours. The next day I was operated on again. This time a piece of bone was taken from my hip and grafted onto my jaw. This time the operation lasted 8 hours, and again, only a local anaesthetic could be used. The following day I was so weak I had to have a blood transfusion. Norwegian nurses immediately volunteered to serve me, and the one who was suitable gave it to me. The one who gave it to me was a girl named Anna. She insisted on looking after me, and believe me, it was a full-time job. She had to wash me, dress me, feed me and massage me. She bought me chocolate, cigarettes and fruit, even though at that time food was getting scarce. Even the woman who cleaned my room every morning used to fetch me chocolates and bottles of her homemade wine. I lay in that room for 8 weeks. I had a lot of pain from abscesses and pieces of shrapnel working their way out, but otherwise, I was very well looked after and comfortable. On August the 26th, 1940, I was taken on board the German hospital ship Stuttgart in company of 52 British prisoners of war. The Stuttgart was a fine ship, clean and well staffed and fitted out, and the food was good. Those who could walk were allowed on the promenade deck for 2 hours a day. We were looked after by a German nurse who was very kind, and she was a native of Danzig. Unfortunately, I became very ill. The doctor said I must have an operation, but that I would have to wait until we reached Germany because certain essential equipment was lacking. After 6 days, the ship docked during the night in Stettin. We were immediately disembarked and loaded into a hospital train, which was waiting at the quayside. 1 carriage was reserved for prisoners of war, and the rest of the train was filled with German casualties. We travelled all through the night, and early next morning our carriage was detached and sent to Stargard. We were met by French orderlies under guard, who had to carry us through the streets to a school, which was supposed to be an auxiliary hospital for prisoners of war. 12 of us were laid onto sacks of straw in a room on the 1st floor. This room was known as Ward 5. We were all bed patients and could do nothing to help ourselves. When I asked for a urine bottle, I was brought a rusty tin, and the bedpan was a battered enamel bowl. Our diet was for breakfast, 1 slice of bread and margarine and a cup of ersatz coffee. Lunch, 1 bowl of potato soup, and tea, 2 slices of bread and margarine. I was there for 3 months, and the food was exactly the same every day. On one occasion, the German sergeant major visited us in the evening and saw the French newspaper on the table. He said we were to keep the room tidy, and as a punishment, we would receive nothing to eat or drink on the following day, in spite of the fact that we were all bed patients. Fortunately, a Polish officer in another ward who had received parcels from his home came to our rescue and made us a little soup, which worked out to be a cupful each. At night, If necessary, we had to crawl out of our room and down a flight of steps to the lavatories. And of course, we were all smothered with lice, and they would not let us sleep. After 2 months, we were visited by an official from the American embassy who took particulars of our names and next of kin and provided us with a form to write home with. He was surrounded by German officers and was not allowed to ask us any other questions. A few days later, we were told that we were being sent home in 3 weeks. These 3 weeks lasted over 3 years. One day, my chest started to swell up, and I asked if a doctor could examine me. Eventually, a French doctor paid me a visit and said he would have to remove a piece of shrapnel. His method was effective, but primitive. He sterilised a pair of nail scissors in boiling water, asked 3 orderlies to hold me down, and got on with it. The dressing and bandage were made of paper. Shortly afterwards, I was deloused, dressed in a mixture of second-hand continental uniforms, shod with a pair of Dutch clogs, placed on a stretcher, and dispatched to a dental clinic in Rostock. Here I was greeted by an Austrian nurse who was formerly employed by the London hospital. I was bathed and put into a real bed and fed well. It was heavenly. The next day, I was weighed and found that in 3 months I had lost 7 stones. I was given as much food as I could eat and soon began to put on weight. The German professor who examined me said I had been shamefully treated, and the doctors that had operated on me in Oslo must have been crazy. After 3 or 4 months of treatment, minor operations, and good food, I was able to start learning to walk again. I was the only prisoner of war there, and I was soon given light work in the kitchen, washing up, potato peeling and the like. At Christmas time, various members of staff gave little gifts of chocolate and cigarettes, and they all ransacked their attics for old English books and magazines for me. I was also invited to join the Christmas party. In April 1941, I was informed that there would shortly be an exchange of prisoners, and I was to be one of them. Within a month of Germany declaring war on Russia, the number of patients in the hospital had increased 4-fold, but all the German soldiers made a point of telling me that the campaign would come to a victorious conclusion inside 6 weeks. They were all quite decent to me, with very few exceptions. The RAF visited us frequently at night, and in the air raid shelter, I was always greeted with a chorus of, "Your comrades are here." I had 4 operations and continued treatment at Rostock, and even there, the bandages and dressings were made of paper. On the 1st of October, I was told to get ready to go home, and on the following day I was searched, and together with 2 other Englishmen who were in another hospital nearby, I was sent under guard to the Obermass field in Thuringia. My 2 companions were badly wounded in Norway, and the first of my fellow countrymen I had seen in 10 months. The next day, about 200 of us were taken to the station on farm wagons filled with straw and put into a Swiss hospital train. Each carriage was served by a Swiss medical orderly. The food for the journey was very poor. It consisted of 3 slices of bread, 1 bowl of soup, and 2 cups of ersatz coffee daily. All the windows were blacked out, and we were not allowed to open them. A German sergeant was continually walking through the train to keep an eye on us. When we passed the frontier and we went into France, all the people waved and made the V sign as we passed. Eventually, we reached Rouen, and the train pulled up in the street near the quay. The German police had great difficulty in keeping the French people away from the train, especially the women, many of whom were arrested for disobedience. After 24 hours in Rouen, a company of German soldiers marched up and mounted a double guard on each carriage. Then Lord Normanby came to each carriage on crutches and informed each prisoner that negotiations had broken down, and we were all to go back to Germany at once. Then we knew the reason for the extra guards, and although it was a terrible shock to all of us, we were determined not to show any sign of it. The Swiss orderlies were very upset and said they would never come to Germany again. As we were slowly leaving Rouen, a gang of little children kept pace with the train for a short distance, all the time calling to the guards to throw them some bread. The return journey to Obermassfield lasted 72 hours, and the guards were not relieved once. We soon got back to the barbed wire routine. The only amusement we got was watching the Germans running around in circles when anyone escaped, and that was very frequent. At Christmas we had good feed, with help from Red Cross parcels, and on Boxing Day, a very clever pantomime. I had electrical treatment for my leg, but nothing could be done for my jaw injury because of a lack of equipment and instruments, but I was not allowed to return to hospital in Rostock. At the beginning of May 1942, a lot of us were sent to Klosterrain, which was supposed to be a convalescent hospital for POWs. Before the war, it was an asylum for the insane, so of course it was considered ideal for us. The trouble was that most of us required operations or further treatment, and we were not ready for convalescence. The authorities were not so strict there, and we were allowed to swim in a lake, go for an occasional walk, and we were always organising concerts and the like, and we could do a bit of gardening. At the end of August 11th, prisoners escaped, and the Germans did not discover it for 3 days. As a result of this, we were all locked into our rooms, and we were not allowed to have any concerts of any kind or entertainment for a month. But the fact that we had pulled a fast one made us happy in spite of any inconvenience we suffered. In October 1942, we obtained permission to erect a stage in one of the dining rooms, and it was made from timber collected from the woods and old sacks. It was completed in time for a wonderful pantomime on Boxing Day and included footlights, dressing rooms, and quite elaborate scenery. After that, plays were put on about once a month and included French Without Tears, Blithe Spirit, and Outward Bound. In February 1943, my jaw became troublesome again, so I asked for an interview with the protecting power and told them that I had had no treatment to my jaw since September 1941. Apparently, this annoyed the German authorities because in April I was sent to the Marburg-Lahn Asylum. I was marched into the town twice a week for dental treatment, and that was the only fresh air and exercise I was allowed. Otherwise, I was compelled to live with the dangerous and pitiful lunatics. Naturally, I protested, but without avail. The books sent to me at this time kept me going. They were a great comfort. After 6 months, I was taken back to Klosterrain and repatriated via Sweden, for which I thank God. Although I was badly wounded, I was repatriated in the ship that brought back the lesser wounded. I landed in Scotland and was taken to a large house just outside Edinburgh and awaited my Red Cross escort to take me to London. I travelled in the train with the nurse, a reserved carriage, and arrived in London on Friday morning on the 22nd of October 1943. I telephoned my home, and my mother-in-law gave me my wife's office telephone number. It had been 3.5 years since I'd heard her voice. I arrived at the now famous Queen Victoria Hospital in East Grinstead, where all the famous skin grafting and bone grafting doctors practiced. I had a series of x-rays to my jaw, shoulder blade, hips and legs, so while I was on 28 days leave they were able to investigate just how bad my injuries were and decided their first steps. I spent a further 18 months in hospital, undergoing operations for my jaw. A bone graft was performed using my only hip left, after the German doctors had taken the other bones. There was a skin graft to my mouth and nose, and I am now able to eat certain soft foods. My tongue is upside down and cut in half due to the neglect in Germany. Through this I have lost practically all my taste buds in my mouth and completely lost my sense of smell. Charles Roy Batchelor's account of his time as a prisoner of war ends abruptly mid-sentence, as if he were interrupted at his typewriter, only never to return to it. His words stopped, and now these words are mine, his grandson. What I know of his time post-repatriation is based upon what I know of him as my grandfather, and various stories, conversations overheard as a child. His written account, however, ended here, almost as if there was a recognition that whatever catharsis recounting his experience brought had expired. Roy, as he preferred to be known, would return to England and receive the War Medal and the 1939 to 1945 Star. He returned to his wife Ethel and made a life for himself, having 2 children, one of whom was my mother. He had a successful career working at ICI and retired to his bungalow in Hayes, Kent. I have fond memories of my grandfather. He was a kind man, stoic, unflappable, and not quick to suffer foolishness. He walked with a pronounced limp, and wore a heavy-duty leg brace, its distinctive mechanical clunking sound still audible to my memory. I remember the scarring on his face, but as a child I thought nothing of it. The awful dinners he prepared for us when we visited now make perfect sense to me. Bland and soft foods, in lieu of any sense of taste and difficulties in chewing, meant that meals were often unpalatable to his guests. Roy had a deep fondness of his rose garden, listening to the radio in his kitchen with a pot of tea, and seemed for all the world a calm, content man. A heavy smoker, he died in the late 1980s, not long after the death of his wife. In hospital, he seemed at peace with what time he had left, and in his final days would speak of an Austrian nurse and how she would sit at the end of his bed and tell him that she had come to accompany him on his final journey. There is no doubt that in the present day my grandfather would have been diagnosed with PTSD and received treatment accordingly. But he was of a different time, where mental illness was less understood and the stiff upper lip of the war generation prevailed. Though of course he bore physical scars, I firmly believe that PTSD is an invisible wound to the soul that will never truly heal. In my own battle against the same illness, I can only wish of speaking to him now about how he became the peaceful man that I remember, whilst carrying the shocking memories and pain of his experiences. Like my grandfather's, my own account of the trauma I experienced in my childhood and the subsequent difficulty in my adulthood is tucked away in my house. I understand his need to write down the things that cannot be spoken of out loud. For many different reasons, it is my hope that my children or my grandchildren never find my account and only remember me as a kind, peaceful man as I remember him. Because in the end what happens, happens, and no will in the world can change the past. Perhaps he would tell me that in survival, how you live your life beyond the trauma, in spite of the trauma, is what matters. My family are everything to me, as we as a family were to my grandfather, bringing us both great happiness and a sense of purpose. A reason to look forward, not backwards. After all, it is only in sorrow that bad weather can defeat us. In joy, we face the storm and defy it.